Within every single one of us, there are approximately 3.16 billion base pairs of DNA, which contain not only our genetic information, but also hold our deepest biological secrets, including the darkest, most twisted ones. At least, that's the case according to a few studies which have apparently found evidence that not so long ago much of the known world was rife with violent, bloody conflict. This conflict was so brutal that its ramifications have lasted until today. It is completely unknown to most and yet, in some ways, represents the first global conflict humanity has ever experienced, spanning across much of the inhabited world, making violence nearly universal and escape impossible. It's not every day that we find evidence for such a destructive conflict, let alone through our very own DNA. But that's supposedly what happened after researchers analyzed the genomes of modern populations, finding evidence of a very distinct genetic bottleneck. Now, bottlenecks in general occur when a population experiences a drastic drop in numbers, resulting in lower genetic diversity. This is somewhat common in nature, with even humans having endured more than one. A particularly deadly and famous one took place approximately 900,000 years ago due to Mother Nature's shenanigans. However, the one these researchers identified was much more recent and seemingly our own fault. To be exact, a team took a look at chromosome sequences in contemporary humans and noticed evidence of a massive drop in genetic diversity only a few thousand years ago during the late Neolithic period in the Old World like Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and so on. This suggests that a lot of people died or disappeared relatively quickly. Now, anything that heavily impacts the population could have been considered an answer to this mysterious die-off. Yet what was so odd is that the bottleneck was only really seen in Y-chromosome diversity, which is unique to males and passed on from father to son. Meanwhile, in the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through females, researchers found no matching drop in diversity. In other words, something had happened that clearly affected a lot of men, but not nearly as many women, leading to the researchers' idea that unprecedented violence may have been the explanation. If the cause had been a volcanic eruption, severe weather, or some other form of natural disaster, you'd expect the drop in genetic diversity to be more or less equal between genders, not just in one. And really, drop is not the best word to describe what happened to the men. A more appropriate word would be decimated, with scientists estimating that this event was so horrific that, by the time it subsided, the effective male population in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East had been reduced by up to 95%. This means that, theoretically, only 1 in 20 men survived this purge, with women possibly outnumbering men 17 to 1. No conflict in recorded history comes even close to this kind of lethality by percentage, not even World War I or World War II. If you wanted to recreate such a brutal conflict today, there would have to be a loss of approximately 3.9 billion men, leaving only about 200 million standing. Naturally, when someone claims that our DNA is proof that a terrible conflict happened, you'd expect to find at least a couple of bodies lying around that we could point to as hard evidence. And as it turns out, there are lots and lots and lots of them. In fact, it's actually hard to miss them. We've discovered well over 250 late Neolithic sites where violent deaths occurred, and that's just in Europe alone. In general, Neolithic humans are notorious for being found in grim conditions, often displaying unparalleled amounts of bodily harm, especially when compared to earlier or later humans. One analysis of more than 2,300 early farmers found that over 10% of the men and women displayed injuries reflecting weapons, likely from raiding parties or competition that attacked for their crops and livestock. Another analysis of 3,138 individuals in Spain found that 23% showed signs of aggressive damage, with adult and adolescent males being especially impacted, making up 97% of the unhealed individuals and 81% of those that showed healed trauma. This suggests that it was very common to experience more than one violent encounter in a lifetime. Obviously, these numbers are pretty high, but they're not the 95% inferred in the genetic study. Yet researchers point out that in many cases, violent attacks don't actually leave marks on bones. Only 15% of fatal melee attacks with sharp weapons leave any sort of bone lesions behind. You also have to consider infections, disease, and other indirect causes of death that are associated with conflict. Now, obviously, these weren't the first people to be found murdered by their own, but their frequency was no doubt extreme. Scientists noted two things that became exceptionally common during this period: battles and indiscriminate massacres. Multiple sites of brutality are known, with one of the most gruesome being the Talheim death pit, located in Germany, and dated to about 5000 BC. Here, scientists unearthed the remains of at least 34 individuals who had been brutally slain. What's even more chilling is that none of the skeletons bore any kind of defensive injuries, implying that they were fleeing, not fighting the attacking party. And across the board, the killing blows could all be placed in just 3 categories. Those that were made by a sharp side of an adze-like tool, those by the blunt side, and finally, the ones killed by arrows, which only accounted for 3 of the 34 victims. Analysis of the skulls also showed that warriors back then often aimed for the head, with all but 4 of the skeletons having lethal cranial injuries, sometimes on top of already deadly wounds. Among the dead, 16 had been children, 9 of them adult men and 7 being older females, while younger women were noticeably absent, a popular theme amongst Neolithic massacre sites, suggesting that they were viewed as valuable and likely taken as trophies by the victors. This particular attack took place within a settlement that possessed fortifications like palisades, which further proves that back then, there was a strong need to wall yourself off from other humans. Sure enough, other massacre sites that took place in settlements also had fortifications, like the massacre of Schletz, which likely occurred around 5000 BC in Austria. This one was far deadlier, with 200 victims known to have been carelessly dumped in a mass grave after a raid on the settlement. Like Talheim, there was again a noticeable lack of dead women and many dead men, but this slaughter differed in some ways. First, on top of presumably kidnapping adult women, they also might have captured preteens and young teenagers, as they too were noticeably few among the dead. Another grim difference was that in this attack, many of the dead were found without their arms and legs, while severed skulls were located separately, evidence of potential torture and dismemberment. This could have also been a tradition for the attacking party, showcasing that different combatants had varying rituals. For example, in Asia, headhunting was particularly common. Another poignant case that further demonstrates this happens to be the largest known prehistoric mass grave, Herxheim in Germany. It occurred between 5300 and 4950 BC, but instead of a ravaged settlement, archaeologists believe they found a community that were the ravagers. They created at least 80 pits right outside their 15-acre village, which were essentially filled to the brim with victims. So far, it's estimated to have exceeded 1,000 individuals, possibly up to 1,500, ranging in age from newborns to elders. If we account for the population difference between then and now, it would almost be like a city building a mass grave with over 800,000 corpses right outside its walls. Nearly each victim was processed in a similar way, with the native population dismembering and breaking bones while also cleaving skulls down the middle. In fact, so many skulls were cut and seemingly defleshed that researchers believe this community were skull cultists who used the heads in some ritual, and most likely ate pieces of them as well. The brain was especially prized for its fatty content, and there were also signs that tongues were often removed from the dead. Bones were crushed for easy marrow extraction, and to add to the horror, scientists realized that there were fewer spongy bone elements than expected, with certain bones like metapodials and hand phalanges showing preferential biting. In other words, these people had their favorite parts of the body to munch on. Many of the bodies were cooked, with some even showing signs of having been spit roasted. When all was said and done, bones were processed into cups, other items, or turned into decorations, as some were found on spikes near the settlement's entrance. Suffice to say, this was just about the worst group you could get caught by. But avoiding them might have been harder than you'd think, because despite the lack of transportation back then, they still managed to wage war on a large scale. Many of their victims came from vastly different cultures, some found as far as 300 miles away. The dead also varied in lifestyle. Some isotopes demonstrated that they were hunter-gatherers, while others were farmers. Victims included those from the mountains and those from the lowlands, all pointing to the idea that Herxheim's natives were a horrifically bloodthirsty people. And while their settlement was large by Neolithic standards, it was still significantly smaller than 1,000, possibly less than 50 people. A truly terrifying group, impressive in a very dark way. That being said, there are still some mysteries regarding this place. Who exactly were the dead captives of war? Slaves? Or were some just unlucky travelers that got too close? Also, no one is really sure what happened to the natives of Herxheim. Some tests suggest that the settlement was abandoned soon after the massacres took place, with a maximum settlement time of 50 years following the burials. This has led people to wonder if another group came seeking retribution, so obviously it's hard to argue against Herxheim as being the most gruesome site we know of. But such weird specific brutality was not isolated to just this case. Many more instances are known of warriors who collected heads. You've got groups that systematically broke and removed shins. Yep, there was that too. Xenophobic groups hunted down and mutilated newcomers. Boom, done. And then, finally, you even had fighters that buried people alive because, apparently, that was a thing as well. In addition to a diverse range of brutality, there was also a lot of diversity when it came to the weapons themselves. Many kinds of blunt and sharp weapons were used in battles, such as adzes, spears, bows and arrows, axes, clubs, knives, scrapers, sickles, hoes, hammers, the list goes on. Unfortunately for combatants, the level of armor back then did not match the innovativeness of their weapons. No standard protection is known of, and fighters likely didn't wear much besides animal skin, woven cloth, and plant material. Simply growing up was an accomplishment, with the level of violence resulting in a measly lifespan of between 20 and 33 years old. This ties it for first place as the time when modern humans died the youngest. And this is even accounting for infant mortality, because even if you made it to, say, 15, you'd still be expected to not make it past 33. With all this nightmare fuel considered, it really just leads to one simple question. What the hell was going on? Why was everyone seemingly in a non-stop fight with everyone else? Sadly, there isn't one single clear answer to this, but there are a few different ideas. Ironically, one of the top hypotheses pins it on humans flying too close to the sun. To be exact, not so long before the violence kicked off, humanity entered the Neolithic Revolution, also known as the First Agricultural Revolution. This period in history saw many human cultures transition from hunter-gatherers to settlers and farmers. This allowed for a boost in population and the ability to establish full-fledged settlements, which in turn led to progress in other areas as well. This sounds great on paper, but this success also meant that humans could now better organize large, battle-worthy groups courtesy of these settlements. They also had access to a wider range of weapons than ever before. Additionally, this shift provided humans with new reasons to kill that didn't really exist beforehand. They now knew that settlements and farms equaled guaranteed loot, food and women, all in one place. Furthermore, by proximity alone, settlements might have been viewed as hostile by others and potentially as existential threats, leading to the notion that all neighbors were bad news and had to go. The Y-chromosome in particular was so obliterated, beyond just the violent states, that as the revolution was underway, societal structures reorganized. More and more people began forming patrilineal kin groups, perhaps because trust was a rare commodity, and it was easier to rely on those you were related to. This resulted in unrestricted movement for women, but very much restricted movement for men. In other words, no outsiders were allowed if you were a guy. This would have made the Y-chromosome very vulnerable and explains why it was so affected when these clans waged war against one another, ultimately leading to the genetic bottleneck being very much one-sided. But like many ideas, there are those who disagree with this hypothesis. Some scientists actually propose a peaceful explanation. Obviously, as the abundance of skeletons shows, violence was quite prevalent at the time. But in terms of the genetic bottleneck, one team of scientists thinks the patrilineal clans may have split up, often through a peaceful process called lineal fission. Y-chromosome lineages became more vulnerable to disappearing over time, especially due to environmental hardships. This led to a gradual drop in Y-chromosome diversity, as some male lineages were very successful in surviving, while others slowly faded away. This was further compounded by reproductive fitness, where some groups were much more successful, leading to more growth and splitting, reinforcing their dominance. Meanwhile, others couldn't keep up and eventually vanished. Of course, there's also the possibility that both peaceful and violent factors work together to bring the effective male population way down. Whatever the case, there's no denying that something happened, and to this day, the legacy of this bottleneck remains, with certain populations still not reaching the same diversity as pre-bottleneck levels. Had this never happened, things would likely be quite different. This does lead to another question: how did all this potential bloodshed end? Well, it didn't, at least not in an absolute sense. Over time, from a pure numbers standpoint, more people died in wars, especially with the advancement of new technology. However, human populations grew faster than they died, making things relatively better. And diplomacy developed, things cooled off. However, looking at the last 600 years, this cooling off only became significant recently. It was only in the last 100 years or so that we truly started to turn a new leaf, with the number of conflicts decreasing steadily since World War I. While it may be hard to believe today, we live in an extremely peaceful world compared to the past. This is reflected in our long lifespans, which are now over 3 times that of Neolithic humans. Of course, we still have our problems, but at least we don't have to worry about skull cults and warlords, at least for the most part. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel.